Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of My Ruby Story. This week, we're talking to Kurtis Rainbolt-Greene. Kurtis, do you want to say hi?
Hi there. How's it going?
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io. Now, you were on episode 410. We talked about Kubernetes. I should probably also throw this at you and at anyone else who is interested. We are starting a new show called Adventures in Devops, and we are going to be diving into that. We're sort of reincarnating the Food Fight show, if you're familiar with that. So that's
very familiar. Yes, yeah. That's fantastic. I think DevOps needs a lot of attention, especially from software developers like you and me.
Yeah, well, and where we're focused here at devchat.tv on making sure that every programming community has a podcast, has good content. It just kind of seemed like a natural thing. So
agreed.
Yeah. So we reached out to Nathan and Nell. Nathan's not going to be on the show, but Nell will be. So yeah, should be good.
Fantastic.
Anyway, do you want to just give a brief introduction, who you are, what you do, where you work, why you're famous, all that stuff?
Sure. I wouldn't say I'm famous. I just happen to work on some things that people use a lot. My name's Kurtis. I've been doing this for about 13 years now in total. Mm-hmm. My primary open source work is divided between two places, Ruby land with VCR and JavaScript land with my own side projects. I mean, I guess that if the VCR would be probably if Twitter or VCR would be where you would know me if you knew me.
Right. Cool. So let's just dive into your Ruby story here and kind of get an idea of how you got into programming and things like that. In fact, let's just start there. How did you get into programming?
Oh, okay. So 13 years ago, I was, my goodness, what was I doing? I was born and raised in New Orleans. I was living there in New Orleans, and it was a particularly rough time because it was right during the recession. And I really didn't have that many actionable skills, but I did play a thing called MUDs or Mushes, which if you played any text games from the 80s before, you'll know that is, but it's a text adventure that's multiplayer. So think World of Warcraft, but no visuals. And not many people know this, but these games are usually written in two languages. Mushes in general. They're usually written in either C or Java for the server. Oh, and then the second layer is a sort of built-in embedded language, and it's completely unique to Mushes. It's called Mush code. It's like Scheme, but you're not allowed to use new lines or spaces or comments. It's all on one single line. And I learned to program with that. It was, in retrospect, horrible, but I built a whole bunch of stuff. And a fellow by the name of Michael Richter, he came along, and he was an actual programmer. And he says, "You're wasting your time with this. You should get into programming." And he gave me three choices: Haskell, Erlang, or Ruby. And he hated Ruby the most, and that's what I ended up picking as a thing to really focus on.
Sorry, that mute button. It's funny. So that's the one he hated the least. So that's the one you went for, huh?
Yeah, hated the most. Yeah. But I think it was he had so many other. Mr. Richter he mentored me through a lot, but he did it through a way that I probably wouldn't advise these days. Mm-hmm. In that he did it through a very thick lens of cynicism.
Right.
And I had to understand at the time, I didn't know programming was a thing people paid for. Like, that was not a thing. I was making a whole bunch of free stuff in a language that maybe like 300 people knew.
Right.
And it had no value whatsoever outside of the people desiring to play games, these role-playing games online. And I went into Ruby with that same expectation. I quickly acclimated to the Ruby culture, I think, because, I mean, this is at the same time that Why Lucky Stiff's famous Code is Art talk came out. It's the same time Sinatra was released, Constantine Sinatra.
Right.
I remember, actually, I tried to track it down. My first public open source contribution was I made an app in Sinatra, and I realized now I know that I had inadvertently made a framework around, a really, really bad, tiny framework around Sinatra to do common things. And someone, I think it was Constantine, he was like, you should post this. And so I wrapped it up in a zip file and I put it on a mailing list. And people were like, this is cool. And that's the last, that's the first and last thing I ever contributed to Sinatra.
Nice.
Because of the mentoring I have received, I mean, Richter was online, so it was all virtual. I effectively, programming language grew up with this heavy dislike of Rails. Because
interesting.
Richter, he was old school in terms of his thinking about programming. And Rails' magic was something to be chided.
Right.
So I learned a lot of Sinatra because it wasn't Rails, right? And in my childlike brain, again, I was also like 18, 19. So my childlike brain, that was like, oh, that's what you're supposed to do.
Right.
Eventually, there's this company that I'm in the middle of Eugene, Oregon. It's not a huge tech scene.
Right.
It's largely at the time, it's like 1/3 linguists, 1/3 mathematics, and 1/3 senior citizens. Not exactly like San Francisco, right? And there's this one company, and they have an ad on Craigslist for a Ruby developer. And I bluff the hell out of that interview. I'm like, I know Rails. I could do Rails things. I know how to do front-end development. Absolutely did not
write
JavaScript. And so I remember that they gave me a test. The test they gave me was they gave me a really bad program, and they wanted me to fix it. And it was like syntax errors and things like that.
Right.
And fixing mistakes was something I had gotten very good at because I had only myself to go back and forth with over programs. I was very isolated in my Ruby usage. And that was my first job. And the distinct thing I remember about that job was when I was terrible about it. I was very bad at that job. Every bad trait a programmer has, I had to the extreme. And then the other thing is that it paid so much more than I had ever heard. And if I remember correctly, it paid $32,500 a year. And when the CEO told me that, I didn't even understand I didn't understand salaries. I grew up not having, like, my parents weren't poor. We weren't poverty, but above and beyond rent and bills, we really didn't have anything. We were lucky to even have the computer we had. My father, he won an Apple IIe in a Walgreens competition raffle.
Oh wow!
Yeah, no, that's actually why we were Mac fans. Is that one raffle competition?
Right. It's what you had.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they were both writers, so they didn't have money for real computers, and they'd use like a typewriter. But $32,000 a year, that was big money for me. I was making minimum wage, and minimum wage in Eugene, Oregon is pretty good. It was like $7, $8, like $2 above federal. That was a lot of money to me, and also medical benefits. Although I didn't understand those at all. Like I didn't get that. I never used them either because I didn't understand them. And I lasted at that job for 7 months. And my next job was back in New Orleans and for twice as much money, nearly 3 times as much money.
Right.
And that was the start of the career. That was, I mean, like, as soon as I realized that I had a skill set that I could survive on, there was no way I was looking back. And I love programming anyways. I mean, I would have done it without the jobs.
Oh yeah. But that's just really, really interesting too. I mean, a lot of people that nowadays they kind of come in with the expectation, okay, you know, I've gone through all this training, and maybe they went through a boot camp or they got a CS degree, and they just expect to come out with a $60,000-$70,000 salary. But I think one thing that I just highlight here in your story is that you didn't really have a good handle on all of that stuff. You just were getting paid to write code, and for a lot of folks, starting out, that's enough, and then once you've been in it for 7 months or whatever, then you're starting to figure out, okay, this is where I want to wind up. And so that's when you start having the, going through the thought process and thinking through a lot of this stuff and going, okay, now what am I looking at here? What's the story? What's the deal? And where do I want to go? And then you made the next step.
Yeah. So after that first job, there was no doubt in my mind that the next job would be also programming. Mm-hmm. It wasn't even a thing. I was really upset by being let go, although I absolutely deserved it, right. And more. But like, it hit me hard. I really hadn't dealt with the concept of being fired before, and right. And so when the next job came along, that was paying a lot more money. There was no doubt in my mind that I was going to be in that thing. That job, I decided, no, I'm going to take control. So in 8 months, I was like, I'm quitting. I don't even remember. It was stupid. And all the people I looked up to, Ben Lavender, who works at Stripe now, he was like, do not do this. This is a bad idea.
Right.
I was like, nah, I know what I'm doing. I did not. I was an idiot. Because it turns out New Orleans, which the city that I love, it's my home city. Uh-huh. There is worse than no. So Eugene has no tech, or didn't at the time. New Orleans had worse than no tech. It had like a negative. So my father, he wrote websites for Gopher browsers back in the day for Tulane University. They didn't know he was doing it. He was doing it. And when they found out, they were like angry that he had wrote them a website. They're like, well, did anybody tell you to do this? Is this allowed or is this legal? Yeah, right? And so they paid him $500 a month to keep doing it. And that's all they were willing to do. And that's, I say that to set the tone because that's New Orleans. Uh-huh. Modern New Orleans is a little bit different.
Yeah. I have a few friends down there now that are.
Oh yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
It's got New Orleans is a crazy place because like the only jobs there are like, there's maybe 3 companies that you and I would recognize as tech companies. Mm-hmm. The rest of the programming jobs there are military or industrial. And I mean, oil. It's all oil. So we're talking like Ada and like, I'm sure there's quite a few basic jobs down there. Like mm-hmm. it's, that's that kind of environment. So when I quit that job with like one of the few successful startups there was nothing, absolutely nothing. But there was a huge gathering of really intelligent software engineers in New Orleans for whatever reason. Ben Lavender, who I mentioned already, John Barnett, who works at GitHub, the founders of Revelry, blanking on his name. I know Joel, and like 6 others, and we had this angel investor company who would give us free space to do meetups, Launchpad, and it was like, I know this sounds so, I say this, but I know this sounds so up my butt, but like it felt like, when I think back to it now, it felt like a Greek Parthenon. There was just so many great minds there. And we would talk about testing, and we'd argue about deployment, and we'd talk about clean code, and it was fantastic. But I couldn't find any work there. I was way too junior.
Mm-hmm.
And the second job I got, by the way, they made me a senior engineer. And they paid me way more than other engineers who had a lot more experience than me. So that was a huge ego boost and twisted some values that I had for myself. I couldn't find anything there, so I had to leave. I ended up leaving for Los Angeles.
Interesting. So now you're in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And
this is about the time also that I started contributing to VCR. Moran had a lot on his plate. Moran was the original creator of VCR and also a founder, if not creator, of RSpec, a few other things. You know. He had a lot on his plate. It was the dawn of RSpec 2. Rails 4 was coming out. So, of course, everybody was just switching to Rails 3.1, which was the asset flip the asset pipeline. And I get to Los Angeles. I've been given contributor rights to VCR, and effectively ownership. Like, this is just now, it's in my plate.
Right.
And I get a job at a startup, pays well. I finally have figured out what I want to do and how, not what I want to do, but how I want to be at companies.
Right.
Like, what is my role as, I am a programmer as an artist, but software engineering, the career, I hadn't really gotten a grasp on yet. And that was the point where I was like, okay, I want to do back-end stuff, but I don't want to be ignorant about front-end practices.
Right.
And so it's also when I started, like I said, I started contributing to VCR full-time. I acted basically as a groundskeeper. And I've taken that role more seriously now for other projects as well. Set it up on Travis. What was the other thing at the time? Was it Hound CI? I think that was a thing.
Yeah, it was. I don't remember exactly what the story is there, but yeah.
I remember being annoyed at it because it was also like right before they had just introduced statuses for pull requests. And Hound CI obstinately still kept making comments whenever it had updates on the pull request. So you'd have like 1,000 comments on your pull request from Hound CI because you hadn't set up Rubocop yet or whatever. This is the really early days of Rubocop as well. What else? We also use Looks Good to Me. I don't know if that's still around, but that was just basically a way of saying, hey, it was a pull request review.
Right.
I also started contributing to Ruby gems at that time as well. I was pulled on to Ruby Together as a paid contributor around that time, and specifically with the goal of cleaning up Ruby gems, the CLI, the tickets, because there were some old tickets there. And you saw names like ZenSpider, Dr. Brain, I can't remember.
Yeah, Dr. Brain.
Tender Love, of course, just from 2006, 2007 issues that like didn't make sense anymore. You know? Like the world had changed. The difficulty with Ruby gems that I found was that like it was an environment where I couldn't use Ruby gems. Right. You gotta, I mean, like VCR had the similar problem, right? How do you test a library that is intrinsically designed to be a part of the test framework, right? Test layer. And Ruby gems was, how do you like build something that is maintainable and works really well without using the rest of the Ruby ecosystem?
Right.
It was also, Ruby gems was my first introduction to like organized open source development.
Right.
Andre is, Ruby could not have could not be more lucky to get Andre. Like, he runs Ruby Together. Well, he's a run.
He maintained Bundler for a long time, and then
Yes, he did, and still fields questions on it on a daily basis, as I understand it. He has organized something real. I really do truly appreciate his work in our field and others. I think I stepped away after a while. I got like a couple of paychecks, but I realized that there were other people in the community who could benefit from the paid work I was doing because they were better than me at Ruby, better than me at opening source maintaining, but they were having trouble finding jobs.
Right.
And that was about the time that I also started thinking about how our community could do better. Because it was like in Los Angeles, the conversation is constantly, there are not enough senior engineers. Too many junior engineers, not enough senior engineers. And in the West Coast, the conversation is we have to fill, like 14,000 jobs, tech jobs, and we don't have enough people. So I started to think about like, do we actually have a shortage of engineers? And I don't know these people that were like, they lived out in, middle of nowhere. They had no ability to move. They weren't hireable from the sense that I'm hireable. Like they had disabilities or needs that wouldn't be met by companies.
Right.
And here I was taking a position at Ruby Gems or Ruby Together, taking money I honestly didn't quite need because I had a job.
Right.
And so I remember being like, hey, like there's other people that need this. And apparently it was already like on Andre's mind, of course, because he's like a forward thinker, And I decided to abdicate my position at Ruby Together and continue working on VCR and some other gems that this is a rough year for open source and Ruby at that point. A whole bunch of libraries where the maintainers were like, look, I can't do this anymore.
Yep.
I'm out. The Redis library set, that maintainer was out. Paranoia, he was out. It was bad. But nothing really changed.
So what was it like taking over VCR? Because I mean, Myron's still around.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a lot of code in there that you didn't write it. You may or may not understand all of it.
Yeah, so it was rough because VCR is a unique beast. Well, not too unique, but unique amongst most libraries. You have to test it the way you would test a testing framework, right? You have to run these mock tests. So, for example, one of VCR's integration tests is that we spin up a Sinatra server on Travis, and we make requests to it through VCR.
Right.
And if anything gets the Sinatra server that we don't expect to, it blows up, right? Very, very loudly. And like unpacking that was rough. It was also using Relish app, which apparently is dead. They moved on to a new company, or they moved on to a new platform called Cucumber Pro, something like that. Yep. And I found that out actually last month. So that's the other thing about VCR is that all of its documentation, most of its documentation, is actually just tests, Cucumber specs. That's what you're looking at when you're looking on there is just a bunch of Cucumber specs. So that was rough to learn because I'd never really invested time in that. And in addition, a whole bunch of people were clamoring because apparently in Ruby 2.2, there was, and beyond, VCR suddenly had a thread safety issue. And so what would happen is you get these files. For anybody who doesn't know what VCR is, what it does is you hook it into your test framework, and anywhere you would make a network request, you wrap VCR around it, and it records the network request, either letting it go through to the original target or reading from file if it already has one. There's a whole bunch of configuration, but the idea is that in your test, you don't want to have to keep going to Facebook to sign up for a user just to test your authentication. So what you do is, at a minimum, you set up VCR to catch that request and replay back, thus the VCR part, recording and replaying. So we what would happen is you have these two cassettes, and they'd flip-flop some parts of it, right? So some headers from the first request would be in the second payload and so forth. And everybody was like really freaking out. And I had no idea what to do. I mean, when I get a thread safety issue or a seg fault in Ruby land, I switch to libraries. That's my solution to that sort of thing. I don't really know that much about, I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know that much about that type of programming.
Right.
Like I understood that, hey, there are two threads going on and something bad is happening. And that was the extent of my understanding. I've changed since then, but at that point I was like, oh, this is scary. Some random person made a big pull request and said, I fixed it. And
that's gotta be so nice.
Yeah, oh, it was like 6 tickets that I could just be like, gone.
Yeah.
And that was, I guess, the epitome of being an open source groundskeeper. Is you just brush things around until someone comes along and makes something big, and then you just make sure it doesn't ruin people's systems. Make sure it doesn't, like, well, at the time Bitcoins weren't around, but it doesn't mind Bitcoins on the machine.
Right.
And then you triage issues. VCR was a huge introduction to me on how hard it is to maintain a large open source project. Because unlike Ruby Gems got a set level of respect with issues. You rarely got people who come into the issues and were like, hey, it's not working. Because they usually searched Google for it. And Ruby Gems is popular enough. VCR is just popular enough, but not popular enough to be, usually the problem when you're having with VCR is yourself.
Right.
And so Stack Overflow can't help you with that. But we would get, I remember, well, actually, this is very recent. I released version 5 of VCR with a whole bunch of improvements from like a couple of contributors who have done some really great stuff for us. Like we now have, we can do compression on the cassettes. We can store cassettes without compression entirely, not just the cassette compression, but the payload itself. We can now filter all sorts of hooks, or new hooks for people. Anyways, I released version 5, and a day later, I get a issue, and it's already got 7 comments. So I know I've screwed up.
Oh wow! Yeah.
And the problem was I didn't include a changelog in the release, and people were very upset about this. And boy, did that rub me it rubbed me the wrong way that someone would make an issue about a text change like that and not contribute the text. Right. And I realized that it can be scary to contribute to open source. And if you are out there and you were like, I don't know if I should, you should try. Very few people will bite your head off. And if they do, it's probably not worth contributing there anyways. But text changelog, that should be something that I feel from having done this for so long, just to jump at that, that's easiest. And I saw every one of those emoji reactions, thumbs down, unhappy faces, and I got angry. I was like, oh, this is you, how dare you.
I love the finger wagging that the people listening can't see, but
that's fair enough. Neither did the commenters. They couldn't see that either. And so I wrote the changelog, and I gave some extra thanks to the people who had contributed to version 5, and I pushed it out. And then the culmination of the story is that I made the pull request for the changelog, and the test failed that they had before. And it turns out a downstream library, WebMock, had broken its API, and a library that WebMock uses was throwing an exception in text form. And since VCR is all about recording things, so this new text was inside the payload.
No.
And I couldn't release the changelog anyways. I had to wait for like 3 levels of, I don't even know how to describe what. But it's a precarious situation maintaining a large library, because you get people who are so angry at you, and your only answer is often you're doing it wrong. And there's cases where you say you're doing it wrong, and it was definitely not them doing it wrong. It was you doing it wrong. Or someone upstream decides to have effectively an open source heart attack, and you get to deal with the bodies down the river. And I saw some people in that webmock thread who were open source contributors. They were very rude. And all I could think of is, my goodness, I'm glad I don't have this issue. I'm glad that this is not I'm not the author of this project, because I would absolutely be panicking.
Right.
The fact that I broke someone downstream. But I'm lucky that I live at a top level library.
Right.
No one depends on VCR from a library level. Thank goodness.
Right. So what are you working on now?
I am working at a media firm called Media Arts Labs. They do advertising. But the work I'm doing there is effectively DevOps for people, I think is the best way to describe it. There's a lot of really, really thick Excel spreadsheets that are effectively programs in waiting. And I work to make those into actionable, observable, monitorable things that we can actually do stuff with. That's my work time. My free time is mostly spent working on small side projects. I recently just finished up one. I have a friend who's a linguist, and I wrote her a dictionary program so that she could write new stuff for her constructed language.
All this stuff just sounds so fascinating. I want to dive into all of it, but yeah. So are you still maintaining VCR?
Yes, I am. It's still in the same. Like I said, we just released version 5. We have a new core contributor, Ollie, really good guy. He has been taking on a lot of the older issues, and giving a lighter touch to some of the more incendiary ones that pop up. I think what we're going to do is our next big step is to deprecate. We just deprecated 1.8 and 1.9 and 2.0. So I think we're probably going to do 2.2 and 2.3 next.
Right.
We've also got a whole bunch of Java stuff we actually have to try out. I've been using JRuby lately for a side project. And so we've had some JRuby stuff that we've ignored. So we'll be fixing that.
Cool. I'm trying to think what else I want to ask. If people want to find you online and ask you questions themselves, I guess, where do they find you?
I'm extremely open to questions, and you can find me literally anywhere at Rainbolt-Greene, KRANBOLTGRENE. Everywhere. I have the only person with this name in the world. So if you can't find me, you're not looking.
Sounds good. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Do you have some things you want to shout out about on the show?
Yes. Is a video game okay?
Yeah.
I have been playing 2 video games recently that I love. One of them is very peaceful. It's called Foundation. It's a fun little city manager with two unique things. One of them is that you use a paintbrush to tell your citizens where they can do things like extract resources or live. Mm-hmm. And 2, you don't place down housing. Your citizens place down housing where the best place, closest to where they want to work, which is the other game is a little bit more violent, so be wary if you're not into guns, is Escape from Tarkov, a highly realistic shooter where the ultimate goal is to leave the map without dying. It's interesting in that there are players, there are AI, and there are players who look like AI. Okay. And so obviously everybody is aggressive towards the regular players, but the player AI characters, as you can just jump in, you're in one, and you will not be aggressive to the AI, and the AI will not be aggressive to you. Mm-hmm. but you can pretend to be one of them. So it's fun to just pretend to be an AI. The AI in the game is not overly complex. So one trick is to try and spot the other AI players, and because if you can get them, you're not in trouble for it. If you can kill them, you don't get in trouble. Right. It's very fun and exciting, and it's a lot of risk and reward. You'll see some pile of loot, and you could go diving for it, but when people see you, they'll know you're a player. They'll absolutely know you're a player. And then can you get to the exit with all that great loot? Those are the two games I've been playing lately a lot.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of picks here too. They're a little bit more practical for people who are running a business and things like that. So we've got a bunch of podcasts, in the works and things like that. And one of the things that I've been working on is just planning out my next 3 months. And I use a system out of a book called The 12-Week Year. And basically it's just kind of short-term goal setting for, your long-term goals. And it is awesome. So I highly recommend that to anybody really who's trying to, get ahead and work towards specific long-term things that they want to work for. It forces you to think about, okay, what can I do within the next 3 months? And then gives you specific system and tactics to actually go and, make strides toward it. So I've been filling that in, and it's been terrific. I've been doing it on a system called Notion.so.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
I love it. My big complaint, period, the end, is that they don't have an API, because I would love to do automations against it. It's on their coming soon list, because I think I'm not the only person who's complained about it. But yeah, once that comes into play, it's going to be awesome. And I'm really looking forward to it. And then finally, I've been working on a system called Podwrench, and it's an application for podcasters, helps maintain their content calendar and things like that. If you go to podwrench.com, I've written a bunch of copy in there that I need to actually rewrite now, because I've kind of figured out more of a marketing strategy I want to follow. But I definitely want people to try it out. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, reach out to me and let me know. And in that vein, I guess a few other things I should throw out there are, I mentioned we're starting Adventures in Devops. We're also starting a bunch of other shows. We're starting a blockchain show, Adventures in Blockchain. I'm kind of stuck with the Adventures in theme here, so you'll kind of pick that up. Adventures in .net should start recording soon. We have a data podcast called Data Therapy coming out. Support or Sustain Our Software is a podcast about open source sustainability, which is something we've talked a lot about here. If you've listened to Ruby Rogues, Eric Berry, who's also local here, by the way, he lives a few more miles away from me than David Brady does. He's going to be on that, along with PM Mancini from Open Collective, and Richard Litzauer from Sustain OSS, and we've got a few other people that are really interesting and very involved in the open source space that are going to be coming on and talking about that. And we're going to be talking about everything from sort of how to get the payoff from doing open source, because a lot of, and avoiding the burnout, which are kind of related, not 100% related, but they're sort of related. And then, maintainability and working with people and things like that in the open source setting. So we have a lot of stuff coming, and it's really, really exciting. Most of these shows, though, we actually have an opening or two for hosts. And so if you're interested in being a host on any of these shows, send me an email, chuck@devchat.tv, and let me know. And we'll get that rolling. The other ones that I don't have specific start dates on, that I'm hyper-focused on out of that 12-week year, that three-month plan, and my goal is to get those started within the next few weeks to a month, are artificial intelligence. I've got a few people I'm talking to, but nothing solid yet. But I'm hoping to solidify that by the end of July, with a panel and recording times and everything. So that's AI and machine learning, virtual reality and augmented reality, or mixed reality, depending on how you think about it. And I've got 1 or 2 people there, and we're just finalizing that and getting a few more people involved. And Python. And Python's going to be run by Reuven Lerner, who is one of our hosts on the Freelancer Show. So he's kind of spearheading that and helping find people. So anyway, if you're interested in any of that, I kind of want to get all this out of my head and into the podcast so that people know, hey, this is available. So anyway, those are the things I'm shouting out about. We also just barely launched devchat.tv, or relaunched devchat.tv. And I've mentioned kind of the technologies behind it on a couple of different shows, and now I'm actually optimizing it and things like that. So if it loads slow for you for whatever reason, and you can give me some feedback on that, or if there's specific content you'd like me to make easier for you to find or anything like that, let me know, chuck@devchat.tv. All right, Kurtis, thank you for coming and talking to us.
I'm glad. I hope someone can find some insight or wisdom out of my rambling.
Well, it's interesting because people get into a situation similar to where you're at, and then they go, oh, yeah, what he did, is definitely what I want to do. Or, some of the cautionary stuff. It's like, yeah, well, that's not the way to go. So, right.
I can agree.
So, yeah. So I think it's helpful. And the other thing is a lot of people, they think it's just them. Whatever it is that they're dealing with, they think it's just them. And the reality is that we all go through stuff. We're all figuring this stuff out. And so it's nice to just hear, hey, you know what? What I'm going through is normal. And if I stick it out, then, good things will come. So
I see. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it again.
Yeah, thanks for coming. We'll go ahead and wrap this one up, folks, and we will be back next week.
Bye.
Bye. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with